The rain had not stopped for 3 days when the men from the courthouse pried open the warped door of the abandoned smokehouse. No one wanted to be the first to step inside. The place had long been whispered about. A slant-roof building crouched behind what had once been a sprawling plantation. Its beams sagged under decades of humidity, its floorboards swollen like old bruises. Yet something had drawn the county surveyor to inspect it, an entry in a probate ledger, a half-visible notation referring to a locked chest, containing issue, a phrase that made little sense until the hinges finally snapped with a sound like a wet sigh. The smell that rolled out was sharp and metallic, mingled with mold and the sourness of long-rotted paper. Inside the chest, wrapped in disintegrating linen, lay a collection of tiny bone fragments, each carefully separated and tied with faded string. Someone had taken great care to label them, initials, dates, names that belonged to no grave in the cemetery records. A man with a lantern held the light closer, and the shadows of the bones quivered on the wall like trembling hands. None of the men spoke for several seconds. Then the sheriff, always one for plain words, muttered, "God help us, what the hell were they doing out here?" But the chest was only the beginning. Behind it was a bundle of letters so fragile they broke at the edges when touched. Scrawled on them were testimonies, some in slanted, educated script, others in messy, frightened handwriting that pointed not to a single crime, but to generations of them. The men read enough to understand they had unearthed something monstrous, a secret rooted in bloodlines that twisted through the family that once owned these acres. A woman's name appeared again and again, threaded through the letters like a lament. Mariah. The scope of what happened here would extend far beyond this decaying room. It involved powerful families whose portraits still hung in courthouse halls, a tangled legacy of violence and ownership, and children born into a cycle too horrifying for the mind to grasp. Unraveling this truth would cost reputations, fortunes, and perhaps the sanity of anyone who dared trace its origins back to their source. Before we continue with the story of Mariah and the house that tried to erase her, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. Dust still clung to the air as we stepped backward in time, toward the era when this land was not quiet, when the fields echoed with the clatter of iron tools and the rustle of cane leaves as tall as a man's shoulders. The year was 1834, and the county, isolated, humid, and ruled by the sprawling plantations that dominated the riverbanks, was a world shaped by hierarchy, faith, and fear. Travelers approaching the region from the east often spoke of the way the land changed subtly the closer they came to the large estates. The road narrowed until it was no more than a packed dirt path lined by wild dogwoods and cypress trees dripping with long gray moss. The air thickened, humming with the steady chorus of cicadas, and the smell of damp earth and cane pulp settled into one's clothes. By the time a traveler emerged onto the first cleared stretch, where fields rolled in disciplined rows toward the horizon, he knew he had entered a place where time moved differently, slower, heavier, bound by old orders. The plantation houses dotted these fields like pale islands. Each stood 2 or 3 stories high, fronted by columns meant to impress visitors with the owner's refinement. Yet for all their symmetry and whitewashed calm, there was always something brooding just behind the shutters, an undercurrent that spoke of the labor and human cost that upheld such elegance. Every dawn, even before the roosters crow, one could hear the shuffle of feet on packed dirt as enslaved workers were herded toward the fields, the dull thud of hoes striking soil, the steady murmur of overseers calling out instructions. Inside the main house of the estate where Mariah would one day live, mornings began with the rustling of skirts over polished floorboards. The mistress of the house moved like a specter through the hallway, carrying the scent of lavender water and starch. She would stop by the dining room to give quiet commands about the day's meals, though her voice rarely rose above a whisper. The master, however, rose with a different temperament. His footsteps were heavy, his expectations heavier. His presence filled the home like a storm cloud, drifting first into the office where he reviewed ledgers that tracked every acre, every crop, every life held in ownership. In town, a few miles away, the rhythms were different, but no less rigid. A small cluster of brick buildings formed the courthouse square, where merchants sold everything from cloth to tobacco pipes. The church bell rang out on Sundays and on market days, summoning townsfolk and field hands alike. The sermons thundered about order and divine hierarchy, about obedience as a Christian virtue, though few spoke aloud the truth everyone felt but dared not state, that the system these men of God blessed was built on suffering. Shadows gathered early in those years. Newspapers carried headlines about abolitionists stirring unrest in northern cities, about escaped individuals crossing the Ohio River in the dead of night, about slave patrols tightening their grip. Rumors drifted downriver like silt, and plantation owners grew more watchful. Fear in places like this was not a sudden thing. It was a slow, seeping presence, settling into walls and conversations until it became part of the landscape. It was in this heavy atmosphere, under a sky swollen with southern heat, that Mariah was born. She entered a world where identity was dictated before one drew breath, where a child inherited not only the mother's status, but also the weight of the master's desires. Her earliest memories would be marked by the smell of boiling cane syrup, the clatter of tin cups, and the soft songs sung by the older women in the quarters when the moon hung low. The plantation's enslaved community lived in a row of small cabins beyond the fields. Each had a chimney of rough brick, a single room crowded with straw pallets, and a dirt floor that turned to thick mud in the rainy season. But inside those cramped spaces, life persisted. Children laughing, elders teaching stories, women weaving sweetgrass baskets by lamplight. They carved small sanctuaries from the oppression surrounding them, creating pockets of humanity in places designed to strip it away. The nights brought their own sounds. The clopping of horses' hooves as the overseer made his rounds, the distant hoot of an owl, and sometimes the sharper noises, the kind that made people sit up in silence, afraid to interpret them. These were not merely nights of exhaustion, but nights of vigilance, especially for women and girls. Everyone knew the master's habits. Some spoke of them only in whispers, others refused to speak at all. But the truth passed through the cabins like smoke, intangible yet impossible to ignore. The social order of the region was upheld through these quiet terrors. The law regarded enslaved women not as individuals, but as property whose bodies and children could be used to grow a man's wealth. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, many preachers who thundered about purity and sin from the pulpit were eerily silent about the violations occurring in the very pews before them. A woman could scream into the marshes, and the water would swallow her voice before it reached anyone who could help. In this era, gossip traveled faster than the river current. At trading posts, white men would lean in close, chuckling about a neighboring plantation's increase, a word used casually to refer to infants born from coercive encounters. They spoke of offspring as one might discuss livestock, tallying bodies for profit. Yet behind the thin walls of the cabins, women banded together to protect each other as best they could. They warned the younger girls, taught them how to disappear into the fields when footsteps approached, and whispered prayers drawn from ancestral memory. The plantation where Mariah lived had its share of secrets, though some were darker than others. The family that owned it prided themselves on lineage, tracing their bloodline to colonial founders. The patriarch kept meticulous records, cataloging births and deaths, but certain entries in his ledgers were deliberately vague. He was a man who believed appearances mattered above all else. The grand house must stand imposing. The family name must command respect. The ledger must show tidy profitability. Behind this facade, The threads of violation began to knot themselves into a pattern that would span multiple generations. On humid evenings, when the sun melted into a smear of orange behind the pine trees, a visitor might pass by the plantation and hear the faint strains of a fiddle carried on the breeze. Children in the quarters would sometimes dance barefoot on dusty earth while their elders clapped in rhythm. Laughter might rise into the dusk, brief, fragile, hard-won. But always, eventually, night returned, and with it the knowledge that joy could be stolen at any moment. Mariah's childhood unfolded under these contradictions, moments of tenderness undercut by an ever-present dread. She grew into a thoughtful, observant girl, her eyes sharp even at a young age. She listened closely to the conversations of the older women and learned early how to read danger in a man's posture, a glance from the veranda, or the creak of footsteps in the dark. The world into which she was born demanded vigilance, and the lessons she absorbed would shape her fate in ways neither she nor anyone else could fully understand. As crops rose and fell with the seasons, as political tensions simmered just below the surface, the foundation for an unspeakable cycle was quietly being laid. It would take decades for its full horror to come to light. Decades before the chest in the smokehouse was discovered, before the letters were read, before the truth shattered the illusion of Southern gentility. But for now, the story moves deeper into the lives of those whose choices, cruelties, silences, and fears would shape everything that followed. Their portraits once hung proudly in the main house. Their shadows still linger in every corner of this history. And it is time to meet them. You said, next. It began with small things, events so easily dismissed that the people who witnessed them couldn't decide whether to speak aloud or swallow their unease. On plantations like Harwood's, strange occurrences were often mistaken for ordinary cruelties, the kind that settled into the bones of daily life. But these were different. There was something quietly wrong in the air, something that made even seasoned hands pause in their work and glance over their shoulders as if the very soil remembered more than it should. The earliest whisper came from a girl named Ruthie, barely 15, who woke one night to the sound of footsteps passing her cabin window. At first she thought it was the overseer doing his rounds, but the rhythm was wrong, too slow, too steady, like someone walking barefoot through dew-soaked grass. She lifted the corner of the curtain and saw a figure moving toward the barn, a lantern swinging at his side. The light illuminated the hem of a white shirt and the edge of a leather belt. Ruthie recognized the gait instantly. It was Jonathan Harwood. But what made her breath catch was who followed behind him. Mariah. Her posture was rigid, her steps reluctant, and though the lantern light briefly grazed her face, Ruthie could not tell whether Mariah looked frightened, resigned, or empty. The girl whispered, Miss Lottie, someone's out there," shaking the older woman awake. Lottie sat up slowly. "Don't look out that window again, child," she murmured. "Ain't nothing out there you want to know about." "But Mariah," Lottie pressed a trembling finger to her lips. "Hush now." The next morning, Mariah arrived at the fields later than usual. The women noticed the stiffness in her movements, the slight tremor in her hands as she tied her apron strings. They exchanged glances but said nothing. On the Harwood estate, silence was a survival skill. But even silence had its limits, and soon more unsettling stories began to piece themselves together. One Sunday afternoon, while families in town gathered in the church pews to hear the minister thunder about moral order, the plantation's blacksmith, Abram, walked past the storage shed beside the main house. He heard something inside, a muffled cry, quickly stifled. Abram was a tall, powerful man, but years of witnessing brutality had taught him caution. He paused, listening. He heard it again, a gasp, a thud, a whispered threat in a man's voice. A cold sweat broke across his brow. He tightened his grip on the handle of the bucket he carried. Then, forcing his expression into neutrality, He walked on. Later, when he recounted the incident in the quarters, he said only one phrase, "Ain't right. Ain't right what I heard." After that, the unease thickened like humidity before a storm. It wasn't just moments overheard or glimpses caught in lamplight. There were marks, too. Marks Thomas Harwood noticed and did not question. Marks Jonathan noticed and did not apologize for. Marks Mariah wore without comment. Some days she appeared with bruises that could be concealed beneath cloth. Other days, she moved with such deliberate care that even the children sensed she was in pain. What troubled the enslaved community most, however, were the contradictions. There were days when Jonathan seemed almost obsessive in seeking her out, offering tasks that pulled her away from the other workers, insisting she report directly to him about trivial chores. Then there were days when Thomas himself summoned her to the office, keeping her for long stretches behind closed doors, emerging afterward with his face taut and flushed. The two men avoided speaking to each other about her, but in their eyes lingered the territorial flicker of wolves circling the same prey. Sometimes, late at night when the house was mostly still, Thomas and Jonathan's voices would rise in sharp, clipped arguments. They were careful never to shout words that revealed anything outright. But the tone said enough. One evening, when the moon was thin as a sliver, a kitchen servant overheard Jonathan hiss, "She is mine to oversee, not yours." To which Thomas replied, "Mind your place, boy. There are things you do not understand." Mariah heard pieces of these arguments too. She did not know which frightened her more, their interest in her or their conflict with each other. When she walked through the house carrying laundry or candles, she sensed eyes on her from behind the parlor door, from the top of the staircase, from the cracks of the office shutters. The house grew too small, the land too wide. There was nowhere to hide. Then came the nights she could not explain. Once she awoke outside, lying on cold grass behind the smokehouse, her head spinning, her dress torn. The stars above her seemed distant, wavering, as though she were seeing them through water. She struggled to recall how she'd gotten there, but her memory was a blur, filled with fragments of voices that didn't align. Another night, she awoke in her own cabin but found dirt beneath her fingernails, as though she had clawed at the earth. She washed her hands before anyone noticed, her mind replaying scattered images, a lantern, heavy breathing, the metallic taste of fear on her tongue. The children in the quarters felt the shift too. They avoided playing near the main house, glancing nervously at the windows. One little boy, no older than 7, told Lottie he had seen a shadow with a man's shape and a woman's face standing by the well at dawn. Lottie scolded him for imagining things, but that night she placed a bowl of salted water behind her door, a ritual from her grandmother, just in case. No one said the word curse, no one dared speak of madness, but the whispers grew. The land watched, the house listened, and Mariah, caught between the desires of 2 generations of men, began to feel something in her life bending toward a dark inevitability, as though she were being guided, not by fate, but by the hands of men who believed they owned destiny itself. Soon enough, the truth would rise like a bruise to the surface, and the first real terror was yet to come. The rains returned in the spring of 1847, sweeping the fields with sheets of water that turned the narrow footpaths into trenches of red clay. Storms were common in that part of the South, but that year the downpours felt different, angrier, swollen with a restless energy that made even the oldest workers mutter prayers under their breath. Thunder rolled like distant cannon fire, shaking loose the dust that clung to the rafters of the quarters. The Harwood plantation breathed uneasily beneath the heavy sky. Fear rarely arrived all at once. It seeped into the corners of daily life, into the hurried glances exchanged between workers, into the clipped tones of the overseer, into the tense silences that started growing between Thomas and Jonathan. Something was building behind the walls of the main house, something layered in family secrets and sharpened by jealousy. People sensed it long before they understood it. The first real sign appeared on a night when the wind bent the treetops and the rain fell in sheets so dense the lantern flames near the quarters flickered like dying fireflies. Mariah had been working in the kitchen since before dawn, preparing preserves for storage. When she finally stepped outside to catch her breath, the world was nothing but darkness and the roar of water pounding the earth. She wrapped her shawl tighter and hurried toward the quarters. As she passed near the garden, lightning flashed, white and violent. In that single instant of brightness, she saw a figure standing among the rows of cabbage, unmoving. Jonathan. He was drenched, his hair matted to his forehead, his shirt clinging to his chest. His face was expressionless, yet there was a gleam in his pale eyes that made her freeze. "Mariah," he called, his voice cutting through the storm. Her feet rooted to the mud. "You shouldn't be out here, sir." He stepped closer, mud splashing around his boots. "Father's looking for you." Her stomach tightened. "At this hour?" "Yes." He paused, the rain streaming down his cheeks. "You'll come with me." She hesitated only a moment, but Jonathan saw it. The flicker of reluctance was enough to shift his posture from commanding to possessive. He took her arm more firmly than necessary and led her toward the house. Inside, the storm muffled to a distant growl. The foyer was dim, lit by 2 trembling oil lamps. Thomas Harwood stood at the base of the staircase, his face shadowed. His expression was unreadable. "Bring her here," he said quietly. Jonathan's grip tightened. Mariah felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her face still. She had long learned the danger of displaying fear. Thomas looked her over, her soaked dress, her trembling sleeves, the strands of hair stuck to her neck. "You were late to the smokehouse today." "I was told to help in the kitchen, sir." "By whom?" "Mrs. Harwood." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably. Thomas's gaze flicked to him for just a second. "Go to the office," Thomas ordered his son. "Wait for me." Jonathan hesitated, then turned and walked stiffly down the hallway, pausing only once to glance over his shoulder at her. Mariah kept her eyes lowered. Thomas stepped closer. "You will not let my son disrupt your duties again. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "I run this household," he said, his voice low. "Not him." "Yes, sir." He dismissed her with a brief wave, but she knew better than to think the tension had ended. As she walked back toward the quarters, her heart pounded with the realization that she had become the center of a silent war between father and son, a war fought not with words, but with entitlement. Over the next weeks, the atmosphere grew more sinister. Jonathan began offering her small favors, a shorter list of chores, a pair of repaired shoes, an extra scrap of fabric for patching clothes. He smiled as he handed these gifts to her, though his eyes remained calculating. "These are for you," he would say. "I don't need anything, sir." "You do. You just don't know it." Mariah learned to avoid him. She kept her distance, slipped into doorways when she heard of his boots on the floorboards, and took alternate routes across the yard. But no matter how carefully she planned her days, his presence lingered like a shadow at her back. One day, she overheard him speaking to his tutor in the library. His voice drifted through the half-open door, precise and trembling with frustration. "She thinks she can ignore me. Perhaps she is simply busy." "No." His tone sharpened. "She belongs here. She is part of this house. I will not be disregarded by someone like her." Someone like her. The words hit Mariah like a blow. She slipped away before she could hear more. Meanwhile, Thomas grew increasingly unpredictable. He paced the veranda at night, staring into the darkness. He dismissed the overseer twice in 1 week over minor errors. His ledgers filled with frustrated annotations and angry slashes instead of tidy rows of numbers. Sometimes he called Mariah to his office to question her about mundane tasks, sweeping, cleaning, errands, only to drift into long, uncomfortable silences, studying her as though her presence alone provoked him. One evening, she attempted to leave the room after completing her assigned task. Thomas caught her wrist gently, but firmly enough that she stopped breathing for a moment. "You're not afraid of my son, are you?" he asked quietly. She kept her voice neutral. "It is not my place to fear anyone, sir." His lips pressed into a hard line. He released her. "Go." She went. But the fear followed her like a scent. Then the strange illness began. It struck only one person, Mariah. At first it was faint, a dizziness in the mornings, a heaviness in her limbs, a peculiar metallic taste on her tongue. She hid the symptoms as best she could. She worked slowly, steadily, forcing herself to keep pace. But soon her body betrayed her. She fainted twice in 1 week, once near the garden, again in the laundry. Each time she awoke to faces peering down at her, concerned but afraid to speak what they suspected. Aunt Lottie pulled her aside one evening and pressed a hand to her stomach. "Child," the old woman whispered, "tell me true. When was your last course?" Mariah swallowed hard. "I don't know." "You know." Tears pricked her eyes. She shook her head. "You carrying," Lottie murmured. Mariah closed her hands around her own stomach, trembling. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff. But the old woman wasn't finished. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a breath. "Whose child is it?" The question hung heavy in the air. Mariah didn't answer. She couldn't. Across the plantation, whispers rose like smoke. Some believed it was Thomas's child. Others believed it was Jonathan's. A few feared it might be both, in some impossible way that twisted lineage into something monstrous. But no one spoke these thoughts aloud. To speak was to invite punishment. The house noticed, of course. Jonathan noticed first. His tone changed when he approached her, his voice softening, his gaze warming into something disturbingly tender. "Is it true?" he whispered one morning as she arranged the tea service. "Tell me." She continued setting the tray. "You don't have to be afraid of him. I'll take care of you." Her hands froze. He leaned closer. "I mean it." "Please," she murmured. "Let me work." He stepped back slowly, but not before his hand brushed her arm, lingering just long enough to turn her stomach. Thomas noticed next. He summoned her late one night while the household slept. His face was pale under the lamplight. He studied her for a long moment. "You've been ill?" "Yes, sir." "You are with child?" She did not respond. He inhaled sharply, a sound filled with anger, panic, and something darker. "Whose?" he demanded. She stared at the floor. His voice rose, trembling with rage. "Whose?" She whispered. "Yours, sir." His face went still. The vein in his temple pulsed. "You are certain?" "Yes." His jaw clenched. He dismissed her with a quiet, dangerous calm that frightened her more than his shouting ever could. She returned to the quarters with her breath shaking. 2 days later, the storm broke. The argument between Thomas and Jonathan began in the office but spilled into the hallway, where their voices carried through the house. "You will not touch her again," Thomas roared. "You have no right," Jonathan shouted back. "She is mine." "Everything on this land belongs to me," Thomas spat, "including her, including that child." A pause. A dead, heavy pause. Then Jonathan's voice, lower and more venomous than Mariah had ever heard it. That child might be mine. Silence fell like a blade. Mariah stood outside the window, her hands gripping the sill so tightly, her knuckles whitened. Every word cut her, but she forced herself to stay quiet. She knew she should run, hide in the fields, vanish into the shadows of the cane rows, but her legs would not move. Something rooted her in place. Inside, furniture scraped. A crash, a growl of pain. Boots striking the floor violently. "You disgrace this family," Thomas yelled. "You already have," Jonathan snarled. The argument devolved into the savage sounds of fist against flesh, two men fighting not out of principle, but out of possession. When the noise stopped, a sickening quiet settled over the house. Later that night, Mariah woke to the sound of the front door slamming open. Jonathan stormed across the yard, a lantern in hand, its flame whipping wildly in the wind. Lightning illuminated his face, wild, contorted, consumed by a rage that frightened her to her core. "Mariah!" he shouted. "Mariah, where are you?" She ran. Branches tore at her arms as she fled into the woods. Her breath came in sharp bursts. Her dress tangled around her legs, slowing her down. But she didn't stop. Somewhere behind her, Jonathan continued calling her name, his voice breaking into something nearly feral. When she finally collapsed near the creek bed, chest heaving, she realized she had run farther than she ever had in her life. The storm raged above her, the sky splitting open with lightning. But even then, even in the mud and rain, a terrible understanding settled over her. Her child, whoever its father truly was, had become the center of a struggle that would only grow more violent. A struggle that would soon involve not just father and son, but grandson. A struggle that would tear the Harwood legacy open and reveal horrors no one on the plantation was prepared to face. And the first casualty of that legacy was already growing inside her. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. The rain stopped 2 days later, but the tension on the Harwood estate did not. It clung to the air like the lingering echo of thunder, settling into every corner of the property. Even the animals sensed it. The horses in the stable kicked at their stalls without cause, and the hounds paced the fence line with their hackles raised. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Mariah did not return to work for 3 days. The older women in the quarters tended to her, keeping her hidden from both Harwood men. They spread the rumor that she was gravely ill, hoping the fear of contagion might keep the white men away. But illness was not something the Harwoods respected unless it threatened their own comfort. By the 4th day, word reached the big house, and Jonathan came looking for her. He arrived at the quarters with the confidence of someone who believed the world parted before him. The workers scattered at the sight of him, melting into doorways and behind laundry lines. He strode straight to Aunt Lottie's cabin and pushed open the door without knocking. Lottie was sitting beside Mariah, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. Mariah sat upright the moment he entered, her breath catching. Jonathan stepped through the doorway, his face composed but his eyes sharp. "You've been avoiding me," he said. Lottie rose with surprising speed for her age. She planted herself between him and Mariah. "Sir, she's sick," she said evenly. "A fever's on her. Ain't fit to stand." Jonathan barely glanced at the old woman. "I'll decide that." He reached for Mariah's arm, but Lottie held her ground. "She needs rest." Jonathan paused, taken aback by the firmness in her voice. It was rare for an enslaved woman, especially one of advanced age, to speak with such conviction to a white man. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the room felt dangerously small. Then he exhaled slowly, a thin veneer of civility returning. "I'll speak to her outside," he said. "Alone. Mariah forced herself to stand, though her legs trembled. The two stepped out into the humid air, stopping beneath the skeletal branches of a pecan tree. The breeze smelled of wet bark and earth. Jonathan studied her. "Father told me his version of events," he said. "He told me the child is his." Mariah's breath hitched. The ground felt unsteady beneath her feet. "Tell me the truth," Jonathan said, stepping closer. "Is it his, or is it mine?" She stared at the mud, the words locked in her throat. He reached out, lifting her chin with his fingertips. "Look at me." She did, though fear tightened her chest like a vice. "Whose child is it?" he whispered. A tear slid down her cheek, not from sorrow, but from exhaustion, from knowing that whatever answer she gave would only ignite further fury. "I don't know," she said softly. His expression flickered, shock, hurt, disbelief, something darker. "You do know," he insisted. She shook her head. "I don't." His hand dropped. His face hardened. "You're lying." "I'm not, sir." "You're lying," he repeated, the words trembling with anger. "You're trying to wound me, or protect him, or—" He broke off, stepping back, his breath uneven. "I won't be treated like this," he snapped. "Not by you, not by anyone." He left abruptly, boots splashing through the wet grass, and Mariah felt her strength drain from her body. When she returned to the cabin, Lottie closed the door behind her and locked it. "You can't be out there alone," the old woman murmured. "Not now, not with both of them circling." And she was right. Both men had turned inward, brooding in different ways. Thomas became quiet and withdrawn, spending long hours in his office, emerging only to bark orders or pace the veranda. Jonathan, on the other hand, became restless, roaming the grounds at odd hours, muttering to himself, sometimes stopping suddenly, as if struck by a thought too terrible to voice. But the true escalation came not from the men of the house, but from those who began to witness glimpses of the unfolding madness. One morning, the overseer, Mr. Grady, found Jonathan standing in the stables long before dawn. He was not dressed properly for the hour. His shirt hung loose, half-buttoned, his hair disheveled. He was staring at one of the mares, a gentle brown creature named Dahlia, with an expression that chilled Grady to the bone. "Master Jonathan?" Grady said cautiously. "You all right, sir?" Jonathan didn't look away from the horse. "Tell me something, Grady," he whispered. "Do animals know their fathers?" The overseer blinked. "Sir." "Do they?" Jonathan turned abruptly, his eyes too bright. "Do they sense their lineage, their blood? Do they know who sired them?" Grady swallowed. "Can't rightly say, sir." Jonathan stepped closer. "What about people? Do people know?" "I reckon some do." "What about a child not yet born?" Jonathan pressed. "Could it feel something? A pull?" A drop of sweat slid down Grady's back despite the cool morning air. "Sir, I ain't sure what you're asking." Jonathan stared at him for a long time, then laughed softly. A brittle, fractured sound. "Of course you don't. No one does." He walked away, leaving the overseer unsettled. The same day, Thomas called a meeting with the local doctor, Dr. Whitcomb, a stern, aging man who had delivered half the children in the county. When the doctor emerged from the house hours later, his expression was troubled. A servant overheard him say, "This situation requires delicacy, Thomas. Very few remedies are both safe and discreet." Thomas shot him a warning look. "Nothing is to be spoken of, not to your wife, not to the church, not to God himself." The doctor nodded tightly. "I understand." But Mariah did not. 2 nights later, she awoke with a searing pain low in her belly. She doubled over, gasping, sweat dripping from her brow. Lottie rushed to her side, calling for water, for cloths, for anything to ease her suffering. "It's too early," one of the women whispered fearfully. "She ain't due yet." Mariah's body trembled violently. "Something's wrong," she gasped. "Something—" Before she could finish, blood soaked the blanket beneath her. The women exchanged horrified glances. Lottie leaned down to whisper, "Stay with us, child. Stay with us." Hours passed. Mariah drifted in and out of consciousness, her breath ragged. At one point she heard raised voices outside, a man shouting, another trying to calm him. Later she would learn that Jonathan had tried to storm the quarters, screaming that he had a right to see her, while Thomas blocked him, furious, ordering him back to the house. "She is the future of this family," Jonathan had shouted. "She is nothing but the cause of your disgrace," Thomas roared back. Their fight escalated into blows, again. But Mariah heard none of it fully. She drifted through waves of pain, guided only by the sound of Lottie's trembling voice reciting prayers older than the land itself. Just before dawn, the pain subsided. Mariah's breath steadied. The bleeding slowed. The child had not passed. But the threat was clear. When the women stepped outside, they discovered footprints circling the quarters, heavy male steps that had paced back and forth through the night. The mud showed signs of furious movement. Heel marks dug deep, toe prints scattered at odd angles. As if someone had been walking in circles, watching, waiting. When Jonathan appeared at the fields later that morning, his face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot. He sought out Abram, the blacksmith, gripping him hard by the shoulder. "Did you hear anything?" he demanded. "During the night?" Abram stared evenly at him. "Nothing more in the storm, sir." Jonathan's voice rose. "Don't lie to me." "I ain't, sir." Jonathan took a step back, breathing hard. For a moment, it looked as though he might strike the man. But Abram was strong, twice Jonathan's size, and the younger Harwood hesitated. Instead, Jonathan asked another question. "Does she still live?" Abram paused. He knew who Jonathan meant. Everyone did. "Yes," he said finally. Jonathan closed his eyes in relief. Or was it something else? Something like obsession? Across the yard, Thomas watched his son with dark suspicion. Days earlier, father and son had fought over control. Now they circled each other warily, neither trusting the other, each determined to claim something the other could not relinquish. The enslaved workers observed it all silently from the fields. They saw the way Jonathan stared at the quarters long after he should have returned to his tasks. They saw the way Thomas summoned them individually, asking offhand questions about nightly disturbances and unusual behavior. They watched as the plantation's fragile stability cracked under the weight of two men losing control. And through all of it, Mariah struggled to rise from her bed, her body weak, her mind clouded with dread. She knew one thing with absolute certainty. As long as she remained on the Harwood estate, neither father nor son would leave her or her unborn child unchallenged. That night she tried to run again. She wrapped herself in a shawl, waited until the quarters slept, and slipped out toward the fence line. But as she neared the edge of the fields, a shape stepped out of the shadows. "Going somewhere?" Jonathan's voice asked quietly. Her breath caught. She stepped backward, her heart pounding. He held up his hands as though calming a frightened animal. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "I just want to protect what's ours." She shook her head. "Please, let me go." "I can't." "Why?" she whispered. His expression twisted into something anguished. "Because I don't know who I am without you." A chill crawled down her spine. His voice, his posture, his intensity felt wrong, twisted, as though a part of him had frayed beyond repair. Then another voice emerged from the darkness behind him. She is not yours. Thomas stepped forward, eyes burning. Jonathan's jaw tightened. She's mine. She's mine, Thomas spat. Mariah stepped back until her spine hit a tree trunk. Both men turned toward her, not as protectors, but as predators locked in a deadly struggle. A storm had passed days earlier, but the true storm, the one that would destroy everything, was only beginning. And on that night, beneath a thinning moon, a terrible truth became clear. This was no longer a feud. It was a curse of lineage, a generational hunger, a madness born of entitlement, sharpened by secrecy, and passed from father to son like a tainted inheritance. And soon their descendants would join the cycle. Soon, Silas would grow old enough to understand the legacy he was born into. And the true horror, the full shattering revelation of blood upon blood, was waiting just beyond the horizon. The revelation does not come with a single scream, nor with a single crime, nor with a single birth. It comes slowly, through the steady erosion of sanity, through the shadows that lengthen each year over the Harwood estate, through the way everyone who lived there began to feel as though the house itself was leaning closer, listening, waiting. Silas Harwood was 12 the year he began to understand that something was terribly wrong with his bloodline. He had always been curious. Too curious, his tutors said. Too quiet, his grandmother whispered before her death. He was a child who stared at people longer than was polite, as if he were searching their expressions for hidden meanings. He had a habit of slipping out of lessons to roam the property, watching the enslaved workers with a fascination he could not explain. Silas grew up watching Mariah from a distance, though he never understood why he felt drawn to her. She was always there, somewhere in his line of vision, hanging laundry near the smokehouse, carrying baskets of herbs, working in the kitchen garden. She was older by then, thinner, quieter, her eyes always fixed on some distant thought, and she was never free of the watchful eyes of Thomas and Jonathan. Silas noticed this long before he knew why. One morning, while wandering near the garden, he found Mariah kneeling in the dirt, her hands deep in the soil. She did not hear him approach, not at first, but when he shifted his weight, a twig snapped, and she startled violently, her body tense as a bowstring. "Sorry," Silas murmured. "I didn't mean to frighten you." Mariah pressed a hand to her heart, trying to steady her breath. "You should be at your lessons, Master Silas." He shrugged. "I wanted to walk." She nodded, keeping her eyes on the rosemary she had been pruning. "Walk, then. But not near the creek. Current's strong this time of year." Silas hesitated. "Father and grandfather fight about you." Mariah froze. Silas continued. "I don't know why they do, but they do." Mariah tried to speak, but her voice faltered. "Silas, you shouldn't say such things." "But it's true." "Some truths are dangerous." He frowned. "Why?" She looked up at him then, really looked. And something inside her expression shifted. Fear, exhaustion, sorrow, but something else too. Resolve. "Because the men in your family believe that anything they want is already theirs," she said. "And when men believe that, truth becomes a weapon. For them, and against everyone else." Silas didn't fully understand. Not yet. But he felt the weight of her words settle deep into his bones. That night, he confronted his father. Jonathan was in the study, staring at a glass of brandy as though it were a mirror to his own thoughts. His posture was slouched, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. For once, he looked less like a polished gentleman and more like a man unraveling. "Father," Silas said from the doorway, "why do you and grandfather fight about Mariah?" Jonathan stiffened. The glass trembled in his hand. Where did you hear that? I hear everything. Jonathan set the brandy down slowly. You're too young to meddle in such matters. Silas stepped forward. She's just a worker. Why do you hate each other because of her? Jonathan's expression twisted. Pain, anger, guilt, possessiveness, all flickering at once. She isn't... He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. It's complicated. Tell me. Jonathan sighed. Then he looked at his son with an intensity that made Silas uneasy. One day, he murmured, you'll understand what it means to want something with your whole being. Something forbidden. Something you cannot let go. Silas frowned. But she doesn't want you. Jonathan's jaw clenched. A woman like her doesn't know what she wants. She knows she doesn't want you. The slap came fast. Silas stumbled backward, shock flooding his young face. Jonathan rose from his chair, breathing hard. Don't you ever speak to me like that again, he growled. Not about her, not about anything. Silas rubbed his cheek, feeling something crack inside him, not just fear, but clarity. The adults in his world were not gods. They were not noble. They were not protectors. They were sick, and something in that sickness was spreading. Mariah gave birth a month later. The labor was long, brutal, and soaked in dread. The quarters filled with the smell of sweat, blood, and boiled herbs. Lottie stayed at her side through every scream, whispering prayers into her ear. Outside, men patrolled like wolves. Thomas paced the yard. Jonathan sat on the steps of the smokehouse, head in hands. Neither man could bear to watch. Both refused to leave. When the child finally arrived, the air in the room seemed to hold still. A boy, small, quiet. His chest rose and fell with soft, steady breaths. His skin was a shade between light and dark, his hair dark and fine. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were a startling pale blue. Lottie felt her heart sink. Only one man on the estate had eyes like that. Jonathan. But Mariah did not cry. She held her son with trembling arms, her expression hollowed by exhaustion and fear. Later that night, Thomas demanded to see the child. Lottie refused at first, but Thomas was not accustomed to being refused. "Let me through, woman," he hissed. Lottie locked eyes with him, an act so bold that even he paused. "Sir," she said, "the girl's nearly dead from birthing. She don't need no man in here." Thomas glared. "Where's the child?" Mariah, pale and drenched in sweat, lifted her son from the basket at her bedside. Thomas studied the boy. His jaw tightened. His nostrils flared. Jonathan shoved his way in moments later, breathless, desperate. "Let me see him." Thomas blocked his path. "No." Jonathan's voice rose. "He's mine." "He is not." "Look at him." "I see enough." Father and son stared at each other over the tiny body of the infant neither deserved, a child born into a world where lineage was a weapon. Mariah held her son closer. She felt the heat of their anger like flames on her skin. She whispered, "Please, both of you, leave." For a moment, Thomas seemed moved by her weakness, by the trembling in her voice. He took a step back. Jonathan, however, leaned closer. "What is his name?" he asked Mariah softly. She swallowed. "Samuel." Jonathan exhaled shakily. "Samuel," he repeated. He is not yours," Thomas hissed. Jonathan snapped. He lunged at his father, shoving him backward. Thomas stumbled, then recovered with a furious snarl. They grappled like animals, knocking over a table, sending a bowl crashing to the floor. Mariah screamed, "Stop!" Workers burst into the room, pulling the men apart. Jonathan's voice cracked as he shouted, "I will not be denied my own blood." Thomas spat back. "You will not claim the bastard that will ruin this family." Silas stood into the doorway, frozen, watching his father and grandfather fight with a savagery he had only ever seen in beasts. And then he looked at Mariah, at Samuel, and something inside him twisted. Somewhere deep, instinctively, he knew the truth. This wasn't the first time such things had happened in his family. And it would not be the last. The years that followed were a slow descent into madness, years in which truth twisted like a vine around every member of the Harwood clan. Samuel grew into a hauntingly beautiful child, quiet, watchful, with eyes too knowing for his age. He followed Mariah everywhere, clinging to her skirts, studying the world with the same preternatural stillness Silas once had. Thomas ignored him entirely, refusing to acknowledge his existence. Jonathan, meanwhile, hovered at a distance, obsessed, longing, dangerous. He brought Samuel toys, food, books. He watched him with a yearning that made the workers whisper. One afternoon when Samuel was 3, Jonathan cornered Mariah outside the smokehouse. "I should be raising him," he said, voice tight. "He needs a father." Mariah stepped back. "He has no father." Jonathan's expression twisted. "He has me." "No," she whispered. "He doesn't." Jonathan's anger flared. "You deny me everything. You deny me him. Why?" "Because he is a child," she cried, "not a possession." Jonathan grabbed her arm. "He is mine." Mariah tried to pull away. "You will not take him from me." Jonathan leaned in close, breath hot with whiskey. "I will take what is mine. Always." From behind, a voice growled, "Release her." Silas stepped forward. But he was not 12 anymore. He was 15, taller, broader, hard-eyed. Jonathan turned, startled. "This is not your concern." "It is," Silas said. His gaze flicked to Samuel, who clung to Mariah's leg. "He's my—" He stopped. But Jonathan heard enough. "Say it," Jonathan whispered. "Say what you think he is to you." Silas's face paled. Whatever he was about to confess, fear, jealousy, guilt, a forbidden instinct passed down through generations, he bit it back. Jonathan stared at him, horrified and fascinated. The sickness was spreading, from father to son, from son to grandson, and all of it bound to Mariah, bound to her body, bound to her blood, bound to Samuel. That night, Jonathan snapped. He stormed into his father's study, wild-eyed. "Silas thinks the boy belongs to him. Do you understand what that means? Do you?" Thomas glared. "He's confused." "No," Jonathan whispered. "He's becoming like us." Thomas froze. Neither man had ever spoken it aloud, not even in their darkest moments. Jonathan leaned close, voice trembling. "There is something wrong with our family, something wrong inside us. You feel it, I feel it, and now he feels it." Thomas looked away. Jonathan whispered, "This must end." "How?" Jonathan turned toward the window, toward the quarters, toward the place where Mariah and Samuel slept. "We cut the root," he said. Thomas stiffened. "You mean to harm the boy?" Jonathan didn't answer. "You mean to harm the mother?" Jonathan closed his eyes. "Father, if we let this continue, our blood will be poison. Our descendants will be twisted. This cycle must end." Thomas stared at him. Silence stretched. Then Thomas whispered, "Yes." They had agreed. The men whose madness had created the cycle would now attempt to end it with violence. But they underestimated 2 things: Mariah's strength and Silas's awakening conscience. The night the Harwood men came for Mariah was a warm one, thick with the scent of honeysuckle. The frogs croaked from the marsh. The wind was still. Mariah felt something wrong before she heard it, before the boards outside the cabin creaked, before the lantern light glowed beneath the door, before the footsteps stopped just outside. She rose slowly, heart pounding. Samuel slept deeply, curled beside her. Lottie stirred in the corner. "Mariah." Mariah held up a hand. "Don't move." The door swung open. Jonathan stood in the doorway. Thomas behind him. Both holding lanterns. Both silent. Mariah stepped in front of Samuel. "Please, don't." Jonathan's face was pale, hollow. "This isn't punishment," he whispered. "It's mercy." "For who?" she cried. "For everyone." Thomas moved first. Jonathan followed. Mariah screamed. Samuel woke. Lottie lunged forward, fighting like a woman possessed. The room erupted in chaos. Then, suddenly, the doorway filled with a third figure. Silas. He grabbed Jonathan from behind, wrenching him backward. "No!" he shouted, voice breaking. "You won't touch them." Thomas swung his lantern. Silas ducked. The lantern shattered on the wall. Fire burst across the rafters. Screams erupted. Chaos swallowed the room. And in the midst of smoke and flames, a generational curse was ripped open at last. A tangle of violence, blood, and truth finally laid bare. What happened next would burn the Harwood legacy into infamy, and the aftermath would be worse. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. The fire did not roar at first. It whispered. A thin ribbon of flame climbed the timber like a living thing, curling upward across the dried resin in the beams. Sparks crackled through the cabin, floating like fireflies made of ash. For a moment, one fragile breath, everyone inside froze. The smoke rose in slow, ghostly swirls. Then everything broke. Thomas lunged again, shoving past Lottie. Jonathan twisted free of Silas's grip. Mariah grabbed Samuel and backed into the corner, pressing her body against his, shielding him as the first wave of heat rolled across the room. "Stop!" Silas cried, his voice raw. "You'll kill them!" But the Harwood men were beyond reason. This was not discipline, not duty, not even jealousy. It was the culmination of years, decades, of sickness running through a line of men who believed their blood was sacred, even as it rotted from the inside. The roof beams groaned. Sap popped in the fire. Mariah clutched her son tighter. Jonathan took a step toward her. "Give him to me," he said hoarsely. "I'll get him out." "You will not touch him," she whispered. "He's mine." "He's no one's but God's," she cried, "and God does not claim men like you." Jonathan flinched, not from her wide words, but from the blaze behind him. Fire licked the wall, casting his face in a hellish orange light. Sweat glistened on his brow. He reached out a shaking hand. "Mariah, I love him. Don't you understand? I love—" Silas struck him across the jaw. The blow sent Jonathan staggering into the burning wall. He cried out as sparks scorched his shirt. He stumbled toward the doorway, clutching his face. Silas didn't hesitate. He planted himself between Mariah and his father, his young shoulders squared, his breathing sharp and fast. Jonathan recoiled at the sight. "You dare raise your hand against me?" he hissed. "You tried to kill her." Jonathan's expression twisted in anguish. "I never wanted this. I wanted—" "You wanted ownership," Silas said. "Of her, of the child, of everything." Jonathan's lips trembled. "I wanted what was mine. Nothing here is yours." For the first time in Jonathan Harwood's life, someone spoke the truth he had spent years drowning in liquor and obsession to avoid. And it came not from his father, nor from a rival, but from his own son, the boy born to continue the sickness. Jonathan stepped back, stricken. But the fire's breath grew hotter, harsher, and the walls behind him bulged with heat. Thomas, who had been locked in a struggle with Lottie, suddenly shouted, "Move!" and shoved the old woman aside as the roof timber sagged dangerously. Mariah cried out as a flaming beam cracked overhead. Silas grabbed her arm. "We need to get out." But Thomas blocked the doorway. His face was a mask. Rage, desperation, fear. "She leaves over my dead body," he growled. "That," Silas said quietly, "can be arranged." Thomas lunged at him. The two collided with a violence that shook the cabin. Silas was young but strong, fueled by a fury he had suppressed for years. Thomas, older but broader, fought like a man who believed fear made him immortal. They grappled in the smoke-choked room, tripping over fallen boards, fists colliding with flesh. Jonathan tried to re-enter the fray, but the flames surged, forcing him to stagger backward out the door. Lottie grabbed a blanket and beat at the fire, but it was useless. The flames raged up the walls, consuming the dry pine like a starving creature. Mariah looked around wildly. Samuel cried in her arms. She had no choice. She darted toward the window, small, low, and half-covered by a shelf. Smoke stung her eyes. She coughed violently, clutching her child. "Lottie!" she shouted. "Help me!" The old woman rushed to her side, hands trembling, and together they ripped the wooden shutter free. The frame snapped, splinters flying. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for Samuel. "Go!" Lottie wheezed. "Hurry!" Mariah tried to push Samuel through, but flames rained sparks overhead. She screamed as a burning ember singed her shoulder. Behind her, Thomas struck Silas across the temple, sending the boy crashing into the wall. Silas crumpled to the floor. Mariah's heart seized. "No!" she cried, turning toward him. "Silas!" But Thomas advanced, blocking her path. "You will not leave this room," he snarled. "Neither of you." His shadow loomed, vast and monstrous, against the firelit wall. For a moment, all she could hear was Samuel's sobbing. Then something in her broke, not fear, not despair, but the terrible clarity of a woman who had endured more than any human being should. "You can kill me," she whispered, her voice shaking, "but you will never touch him." Thomas raised his hand. Mariah grabbed the iron poker near the hearth, and she swung. The blow landed with a sickening crack. Thomas staggered, his eyes wide with shock. Blood spattered the floorboards. He collapsed onto the dirt, groaning as the fire crawled toward him. Jonathan screamed from the doorway, "Father!" Silas, dazed but conscious, crawled toward Mariah. "Get out!" he choked. "Take him and go!" Mariah pressed Samuel through the window first. Lottie caught him outside, pulling him into the cool night air. Then she reached back in for Mariah. "Hurry!" Lottie cried. But the fire surged again, engulfing the wall. Mariah climbed through with Silas pushing her. Her skin blistered from the heat. She felt hands grab her. Lottie's hands, rough and steady. She collapsed into the grass, Samuel in her arms. "But Silas!" She turned back toward the window. "Silas!" she screamed. "Come!" He staggered toward the opening. Behind him, Thomas rose unsteadily, blood trailing down his face. "You will not ruin us!" Thomas rasped. He grabbed Silas by the collar. Jonathan pushed past the flames, reaching for both of them. "Father, stop!" he cried. But the roof gave way. With a deafening crack, the beam fell. Mariah screamed. Silas dove. Jonathan lunged. Thomas shouted. The beam struck the doorway, sending fire crashing across the floor. Smoke swallowed the room. The silhouettes of the Harwood men flickered once, twice, then vanished in the blaze. The cabin burst into full collapse. Silas crawled from the wreckage moments later, covered in soot, coughing violently. His hair was singed, his shirt scorched. But he was alive. Behind him, the fire consumed everything. Thomas, Jonathan, the curse they had built. Mariah reached for him, pulling him close with shaking hands. Lottie sobbed prayers into the night. Silas looked at Mariah, not as property, not as obsession, but as the one person who had saved him from inheriting the same rot that claimed the men before him. "Is Samuel?" he whispered. Mariah held the child tighter. "He's safe." Silas nodded, trembling. "It's over," Lottie panted. "Lord have mercy, it's finally over." But Mariah shook her head slowly, staring into the flames as the roof fully caved in. "No," she whispered. "This is the beginning." Because in her arms, Samuel cried softly, and in Silas's eyes, something ancient stirred. Something born, not of entitlement, but of blood. The Harwood curse was not dead. Not yet. And the community would soon learn that the night the cabin burned was not the end of the horror. It was the spark. The flames smoldered until dawn, leaving behind a skeleton of charred beams and blackened earth. By morning, smoke drifted across the yard in thin, haunting ribbons, ghosts rising from the ashes. The entire plantation gathered at a distance, watching the ruin where 3 generations of Harwood men had vanished. No one dared step closer. No one spoke Jonathan or Thomas's names. Fear, long buried beneath obedience, finally rose to the surface. The overseer, Mr. Grady, sent a rider into town to fetch the sheriff before word could twist into rumor, but everyone knew rumors travel faster than horses. By the time Sheriff Murdoch arrived, broad-shouldered, mustached, and wearing a hat still dusted with sleep, the story had already begun spreading like a wildfire of its own. House servants whispered of screams, field hands murmured of lanterns and violence, and the handful who had seen the men dragging each other inside the cabin the night before could barely recount it without their voices shaking. Murdoch examined the ruins with narrowed eyes, kicking aside a chunk of charred timber with his boot. When he knelt, he found what remained of a brass button melted into the ground. Another glance into the heap revealed a scorched length of belt buckle. He exhaled slowly. 2 grown men don't burn in a place this small without a struggle, he muttered. Beside him stood the local doctor, Whitcomb, his spectacles fogged from the lingering heat. "The boy survived," the doctor murmured. "Young Silas. Lucky lad." Murdoch snorted. "Lucky's not the word I'd use." At the edge of the yard, Mariah stood holding Samuel, Lottie at her side, and Silas seated on an overturned barrel, head bandaged. The sheriff watched them from a distance, something unreadable in his expression. When he finally approached, the workers instinctively stepped between him and Mariah, but Lottie lifted a hand, steady as iron. "We will tell the truth," the old woman said. "Ain't nothing more to it." The sheriff removed his hat. His gaze moved over Mariah, her blistered arms, her ruined dress, her haunted eyes. "What happened inside that cabin?" he asked quietly. Mariah swallowed. Her voice trembled, but she spoke. "They came for us, for me and my child." Silas stiffened. "I saw it," he said, his voice low but firm. "My father and grandfather, they meant to kill her." Murdoch studied the boy for several seconds. "You sure?" Silas nodded once. "There's no mistake." The sheriff sighed. "Your family's name carries weight in this county, son." Silas met his gaze. "Names don't change the truth." It was a bold statement, one that would ripple through their town in the days to come. The doctor cleared his throat. "Sheriff, if I may, Thomas Harwood sought remedies from me. Remedies to terminate a pregnancy. Every worker within earshot stiffened. Murdoch frowned. "Did he give a reason?" Whitcomb hesitated, then forced the words out. He claimed it was a sin he needed corrected, a sin committed within his own household. Silas lowered his head. Lottie whispered, "Lord help us." Murdoch let out a long breath. This is going to divide the county right down the spine. Within 24 hours, the Harwood plantation transformed from a seat of power into a crime scene. Local men probed the ruins with poles, trying to distinguish bone from beam. Ladies flocked to the fence line in clusters, whispering behind gloved hands. Ministers shook their heads gravely and muttered scripture about generational sin. And in every corner of town, someone claimed to have predicted this downfall, though none truly had. The coroner's inquest lasted 2 days, the courthouse filled with townspeople so tightly packed the windows fogged over with breath. Mariah was brought in under escort, holding Samuel close, her gaze fixed on the floor. Some townsfolk muttered horrible things under their breath, words like seductress, troublemaker, curse-bringer. Others stared at her with reluctant sympathy, understanding that no enslaved woman had agency against the desires of powerful men. Silas took the stand first. "Did you witness Thomas or Jonathan Harwood attempt violence?" the solicitor asked. Silas's voice did not waver. "Yes." The courtroom rippled with gasps. "And did your grandfather strike your father?" "Yes." "And did either man threaten Miss Mariah or the child?" Silas hesitated only long enough to breathe. "They intended harm. I heard them speak of it days before." Murmurs rolled across the room. Some believed him instantly. Others shrank back in denial. The Harwood legacy was beloved by many. Accepting its corruption felt like accepting rot in their own foundations. Mariah testified next. Quiet, composed, her voice trembling only once when Samuel stirred in her arms. She spoke sparingly, choosing only the truths she could bear to voice. She did not name the father. The room understood why. When she described the flames, the struggle, the terror of shielding her child, several women in the gallery wept. Even the coroner bowed his head. By late afternoon, the jury announced its findings. Death by misadventure in a structure consumed by fire, resulting from violence initiated by the deceased. A delicate phrase, a careful one. But its meaning was clear. Thomas and Jonathan Harwood died by their own hands, through their own madness. No blame would fall on Mariah, none on Silas. The ruling sent a ripple through the county, wider and sharper than the flames that had ended the Harwood line of men. In the weeks that followed, the social order reeled. The Harwood family, once held up as an example of Southern refinement, became a whispered cautionary tale. Ministers preached sermons about sins made manifest. Newspapers hinted at domestic complexities and a troubled lineage. But not a single paper printed Mariah's name. To protect her, Silas insisted. Silas himself became something of a ghost in the halls of his own home. At 15, he inherited the estate, the fields, the buildings, the debts. His mother's family urged him to send the workers south for sale until the matter quieted. But he refused. "I will not continue the sins of my father," he said in a voice cold as winter iron. He freed Mariah the moment he could, though she stayed on the land for several months out of necessity. When she finally left the estate, Samuel on her hip, a handful of workers walked with her all the way to the county line. Silas stood at the road, watching her go, knowing that letting her leave was the only way to break the last tendril of the Harwood curse. Rumor had it she settled in a river town farther south, living quietly under another name. Some said she remarried. Some said she never trusted another man as long as she lived. Some said Samuel grew into a quiet, contemplative child, gentle where his father had been violent. steady where his grandfather had been cruel. And Silas. He ran the plantation differently than any Harwood before him. He released workers as he could, sold land to pay debts instead of selling people, and converted the smoking ruins of the cabin into a small chapel. When asked why he built it there, on the ashes of horror, he replied only, "For remembrance." His voice always broke a little on the last word. The county's memory did not fade. Newspapers clipped the story for years. Ministers referenced it in sermons. Neighbors spoke of it in hushed tones, warning their daughters of men who believed bloodline granted dominion over the bodies of others. Some stories fracture a community. This one fractured generations.